The Obsidian Spire floated in the void between star systems like a monument to stubbornness, which, technically speaking, was exactly what it was. Constructed from the compressed remains of 17 different battleships that had refused to surrender even as they disintegrated around their crews. The Spire served as the galaxy's most exclusive and most morbid gathering place. Its entrance requirements were simple, absolute, and more than a little unhinged. You could only step through its doors if you had never, not even once, retreated from battle. The architects who designed this floating testament to tactical inflexibility had been Vorath, a species whose idea of compromise was simply killing you slower. They understood with the clarity that came from having 12 different words for acceptable casualties, that some achievements deserved commemoration in a place where even the walls were made of defiance. The Spire's interior chambers shifted and reconfigured based on the collective battle experience of everyone inside, which meant the hallways occasionally developed entirely new corridors, just to accommodate the egos involved. Today, the Obsidian Spire hosted the Cygnus Elite, which was less a formal organization and more a mutual recognition society for individuals who had looked at the concept of strategic withdrawal and decided it was for species with better survival instincts. The gathering occurred once every stellar cycle, allowing the galaxy's most decorated, most scarred, and most therapeutically concerning military commanders to stand in a room together and pretend they enjoyed each other's company. Commander Ethanus of the Hegemony Vanguard stood near the central podium, his forearms crossed in a configuration that his species reserved for extreme skepticism. His carapace bore the scorch marks of 47 separate engagements, each one a battle where retreat had been discussed, proposed, and then violently rejected by Ethanus personally throwing the navigator out an airlock. He was, by all available metrics, exactly the sort of individual who belonged here. Beside him, General Rathus of the Burning Sun's Armada maintained her species' traditional stance of aggressive readiness, which looked to most observers like she was perpetually 3 seconds away from headbutting the nearest solid object. The Burning Suns had evolved on a planet where the primary predator was the weather, and they had responded by developing a cultural philosophy best summarized as fight everything, apologize never, understand diplomacy as a theoretical concept at best. Her scales reflected the Spire's dim lighting and patterns that spelled out her battle honors in a biological script that had been evolving specifically to intimidate people for 6 million years. High Executor Phaenon floated near the commemorative wall, his energy form contained within a gravitational field that hummed with barely suppressed violence. The Executors were beings of pure coherent energy who had somehow managed to develop both consciousness and anger management issues. Phaenon had personally held the Nexus Gate during the Void incursion, preventing 14 enemy dreadnoughts from breaching into civilized space by essentially turning himself into a sentient explosion for 16 consecutive hours. He had not retreated. He had, however, required 6 months of reconstitution afterward, which he considered a minor inconvenience compared to the alternative of looking like a coward. The Cygnus Elite did not do small talk. They did battle analysis, tactical comparison, and occasionally passive-aggressive comments about whose species had the higher posthumous medal count. The gathering had been proceeding with its usual mixture of martial posturing and carefully calibrated mutual respect when the doors opened and admitted someone who absolutely, categorically should not have been there. She was human. Approximately average height for her species, which meant she stood shorter than 70% of the assembled commanders, and looked like she could be physically defeated by a strong breeze. She wore what appeared to be formal diplomatic attire rather than military dress. Though the Cygnus Elite possessed enough collective combat experience to recognize the subtle reinforcement in the fabric and the way she moved that suggested significantly more physical capability than her appearance indicated. Her face carried an expression that the assembled warriors found deeply unsettling. She looked amused. Humans were known to the galaxy, of course. Everyone knew about humans. They were the species that had achieved faster-than-light travel by essentially strapping themselves to controlled explosions and hoping mathematics worked the way their scientists claimed it did. They had entered the galactic community with the diplomatic grace of a meteor immediately started arguing with everyone about everything, and then somehow become indispensable through a combination of innovation, stubbornness, and what appeared to be a complete inability to recognize when they were outmatched. But humans were not part of the Cygnus Elite. Humans retreated all the time. They called it tactical repositioning, or strategic withdrawal, or occasionally running away extremely effectively. Human military doctrine apparently included an entire chapter on when and how to retreat properly, which the assembled commanders found baffling. Why would you document your own cowardice? The human walked into the chamber like she owned it, which was theoretically impossible because the Obsidian Spire did not permit ownership, only presence earned through bloodshed. She nodded to several of the commanders with casual familiarity, apparently unbothered by the fact that she was surrounded by individuals who had collectively killed populations larger than her entire species. Behind her, maintaining a precisely measured distance, came the reason why nobody had already thrown her out the airlock. The Unbroken Paladin moved with the inevitability of continental drift. His species, the Aegis-born, had been genetically engineered 70,000 years ago as the ultimate defensive warriors, and they had taken to the role with disturbing enthusiasm. Every Aegis-born carried a shield, and every shield carried a history written in the dense scorches and crystallized blood of everyone who had tried to get past it. The Paladin stood nearly 8 feet tall, his armored form suggesting that someone had taken a mountain and taught it military discipline. His shield, a massive rectangular slab of exotic matter that had turned aside everything from plasma bombardment to reality-distorting weaponry, rested against his left side in the traditional guard position. What made his presence remarkable was not his physical capability, though that was considerable. What made the Cygnus Elite stare was the simple fact that he was standing beside the human, with his shield oriented in a protective stance. The Aegis-born did not offer their protection casually. Their entire species existed as a living embodiment of the concept of defense, and they chose their charges based on criteria that they refused to explain to anyone, including each other. An Unbroken Paladin positioning himself beside someone was a statement that transcended military rank or political authority. It meant, this individual matters, and I have decided they are worth defending. The human reached the central podium and turned to face the assembled commander. Her smile widened slightly, which somehow made the situation more concerning rather than less. Commander Rethonus felt his secondary nervous system activate, the biological early warning system that had kept his ancestors alive on a death world where everything produced either neurotoxins or existential dread. I appreciate the invitation, the human said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber despite her lack of vocal augmentation. I know some of you are wondering why I'm here. The answer is simple. I have a story to tell you. Well, technically it's a joke, but the line between those gets pretty blurry when you're talking about human military history. General Rathis made a sound that her species used to express something between confusion and the desire to establish dominance through volume. This gathering is for the unbroken, those who have never fled from battle. Humans retreat constantly. Your presence here is either an error or an insult. The human smile did not diminish. If anything, it gained a quality that made several of the commanders unconsciously check their weapon status. Oh, I'm aware of the entrance requirements, and I'm not claiming I've never retreated. I've withdrawn from plenty of battles. Strategic flexibility is kind of humanity's, but I'm not here as a member of the Cygnus Elite. She gestured casually toward the Paladin, who had not moved, his shield remaining at ready position. I'm here as his guest, and before you ask why an Unbroken Paladin would waste his protection on a human diplomat, who doesn't even qualify for this gathering, maybe you should hear my joke first. It'll explain a lot. High Executor Phaenon's energy form pulsed with what might have been curiosity, or might have been the gravitational equivalent of rolling one's eyes. The Cygnus Elite do not gather to hear jokes. We commemorate sacrifice. We honor those who stood when standing was death. Right. I know. The human replied, apparently unbothered by being lectured by a sentient energy cloud. And that's exactly why you need to hear this, because there's something you should know about humans and our relationship with the concept of not retreat. See, we've got this weird thing where sometimes we don't retreat, not because we're brave or honorable or strategically brilliant, but because we're just too dumb or stubborn or distracted to realize retreating is an option. She paused, letting that statement hang in the recycled atmosphere of the Obsidian Spire. This joke is about one of those times. It's about a battle where humans earned the right to be called unbroken, not through nobility or courage, but through what I can only describe as aggressive incompetence, mixed with weaponized confusion. And I promise you, by the time I'm done, you're going to understand exactly why my friend here decided I was worth protecting. The Paladin's shield shifted slightly, a microscopic adjustment that those trained in reading Aegis-born body language recognized as agreement. He had heard this story before. He knew what was coming. The Cygnus Elite, proud inheritors of a legacy built on absolute refusal to yield, had no idea what they were about to experience. They stood in their monument to tactical inflexibility, surrounded by the compressed remains of warriors who had chosen death over retreat, and waited for a human to explain something about her species' military history. Commander Ethanus would later reflect that this was the moment they should have retreated. The irony was not lost on him. The human took a breath and the Obsidian Spire's ambient lighting seemed to adjust itself, as if the structure itself recognized the beginning of something significant. This was probably nonsense, of course, but the spire had been built from ships that had developed near-sentient grudges against the concept of surrender, so perhaps architectural attentiveness was not entirely out of the question. About 70 years ago, the human began, her tone shifting into something that sounded like a professor lecturing particularly slow students. Humanity got into a territorial dispute with the Chain Imperium. You remember them? 6 armed militants, exoskeletons that could shrug off kinetic rounds, tactical doctrine based on overwhelming force and numerical superiority. Several commanders made gestures of acknowledgement. The Chain Imperium had been a regional power known for their utterly predictable military strategy. Show up with 10 times more ships than necessary, demand surrender, then act surprised when species chose death over subjugation. They had controlled 40 systems at their peak, and their collapse had been both sudden and embarrassing, though the details remained classified across most of galactic space. So the Imperium decided that humanity's colony on Frost Harbor, a miserable ice ball that we'd somehow convinced 3,000 people to live on, needed to become chain territory. They sent a fleet, not a huge fleet by their standards, just 40 warships against our 6 defense platforms and maybe 24 patrol boats. Standard Imperium mathematics. Bring enough guns that resistance becomes a philosophical question, rather than a practical one. The human's expression suggested she found this memory entertaining rather than traumatic, which already marked her as either mentally disturbed or in possession of information the Cygnus Elite lacked. Commander Ethanus leaned forward slightly, his skepticism warring with genuine curiosity about where this narrative was heading. The Imperium commander, and I wish I could remember his name but honestly, all their names sound like someone choking on gravel, gave us the standard ultimatum: surrender the colony, accept chain governance, or be reduced to component atoms. Very professional, very by the book. He even gave us 6 hours to evacuate civilians, which was more courtesy than the Imperium usually offered. General Rathus interrupted with a growl that made the air vibrate. Then you retreated, evacuated. This is what humans do. You preserve your population, and cede territory. Practical but not worthy of this gathering. Oh, we absolutely should have evacuated. The human agreed cheerfully. That would have been the smart play. The reasonable play. The play that anyone with basic pattern recognition and survival instincts would have made. But here's where it gets interesting. And by interesting I mean stupid in ways that accidentally became brilliant. She began walking slowly around the podium, her movement casual enough to suggest she had forgotten she was surrounded by the galaxy's most dangerous military minds. The Paladin moved with her, his shield tracking in smooth arcs that maintained coverage without appearing threatening. An Aegis-born defensive dance, performed with the precision that came from millennia of specialized evolution. The colony administrator at Frost Harbor was named Huion Frost, because apparently when you name a colony after yourself you lose the ability to make good decisions. She received the Imperium's ultimatum, and immediately sent a response that our diplomatic corps later described as catastrophically informal. She told the Imperium commander that 6 hours was insufficient time to evacuate, and requested a 48-hour extension. High Executor Phaenon's energy form pulsed with confusion. This is a negotiation tactic, requesting more time to flee. Oh no, the human said, and her smile took on a quality that made several commanders unconsciously access their tactical networks. See, Administrator Frost wasn't planning to evacuate, she just wanted more time. The Imperium commander, who apparently had never dealt with human bureaucracy before, assumed this was a reasonable request from a species trying to organize an orderly withdrawal. He granted the extension. The human paused, letting the absurdity of that decision settle over the assembled warriors like radiation exposure, slow and increasingly concerning. For 48 hours the Chain Imperium fleet sat in orbit around Frost Harbor,
waiting for humanity to do the sensible thing and leave. And for 48 hours, Administrator Frost used every single communication channel available to her to send messages back to Earth and every human colony within range. Not distress calls, mind you. She sent complaints. Complaints, Commander Ethonis repeated, his translator apparently convinced it had malfunctioned. Complaints, the human confirmed. Detailed itemized complaints about the Imperium's ultimatum. She complained that 6 hours was insufficient notice for proper evacuation procedure. She complained that the Imperium had not filed the correct diplomatic paperwork for territorial acquisition. She complained that their fleet was blocking standard shipping lanes. She even complained that their formation was aesthetically unpleasant and was ruining the view from the colony's observation deck. The Cygnus Elite stared at the human with the collective expression of individuals who had spent their entire lives studying warfare and were now being told that none of it mattered because paperwork existed. Administrator Frost's complaints were forwarded through human bureaucratic channels with the efficiency that our species reserves for spite and tax collection. Within 30 hours, she had responses from 14 different governmental bodies, 47 regulatory agencies, and approximately 6,000 private citizens, who had opinions about proper diplomatic protocol. None of these responses said evacuate immediate. Most of them said things like file Form 27B in triplicate, or have you tried contacting the Interstellar Commerce Commission? The human's voice carried a tone of fond exasperation, as if describing a particularly difficult but ultimately successful engineering project. By hour 40, the Imperium commander was receiving automated messages from human bureaucratic systems, requesting that he fill out proper invasion paperwork. By hour 45 he was being billed for unauthorized occupation of orbital space. By hour 47, he was being sent customer satisfaction surveys about his ultimatum experience. General Rathis made a sound that suggested either her translator had broken, or her species had no evolutionary context for what she was hearing. This is a military strategy. This is human confusion, being weaponized through institutional momentum, the human replied. Administrator Frost never ordered anyone to fight. She just refused to process the concept of retreat until the proper forms had been filed. And while the Imperium fleet sat in orbit, increasingly bewildered by the flood of bureaucratic nonsense being transmitted at them, something else was happening.
The human's expression shifted into something that made the Obsidian Spire's lighting flicker. Or perhaps that was just the collective anxiety of warriors, realizing they were about to hear something that would fundamentally disturb their understanding of military doctrine. Human naval doctrine has this interesting quirk, she continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining why their house was on fire, and it was technically nobody's fault. When a colony sends out a distress signal, which Frost Harbor technically never did, the nearest military assets are supposed to respond. But when a colony sends out bureaucratic complaints that get escalated to 14 governmental bodies, something much weirder happens. Every ship, station, and armed vessel within range starts receiving automated priority notifications about unresolved diplomatic incidents requiring immediate documentation. Commander Ethonis felt his primary and secondary nervous systems achieve a rare moment of unified concern. Documentation. Documentation, the human confirmed. Within 36 hours of Administrator Frost's initial complaints, 47 human vessels had altered course toward Frost Harbor, not because they were ordered to fight, but because bureaucratic protocols required them to arrive and file incident reports. Most of these ships were civilian transports, mining vessels, and one absolutely ancient cruise liner that had been converted into a mobile archive. None of them were warships. The human paused, and her smile acquired edges that could have been used for industrial cutting applications. But here's the thing about human civilian vessels. We don't really do unarmed. A mining ship has industrial-grade cutting lasers that can crack asteroids. A transport hauler has engines powerful enough to move 1 million tons of cargo, which means they can accelerate fast enough to turn physics into a weapon. And that cruise liner, it had been documenting human military history for 70 years, which meant it was carrying approximately 6,000 different types of obsolete weapons that were technically museum pieces but still functionally terrifying. High Executor Phaenon's energy form contracted slightly, the gravitational equivalent of someone wincing. They armed themselves with museum exhibits. They armed themselves with whatever was available, and within regulatory compliance for civilian vessels responding to bureaucratic incidents, the human corrected. Which is a much longer and more terrifying sentence. By hour 47, when the Chain Imperium's extended deadline expired, there were 47 human ships in the system. The Imperium commander, who had expected to find an evacuated colony and maybe some token resistance, instead found himself surrounded by what his tactical systems classified as a poorly organized civilian convoy that was emitting enough weapons signatures to sterilize a small movement. The Cygnus Elite were silent, which was remarkable given that silence was usually the prelude to violence in this particular gathering. They were experiencing the collective realization that they were listening to a story about humans accidentally assembling a fleet through institutional incompetence and bureaucratic momentum. The Imperium commander, the human continued, her voice rich with the kind of satisfaction that came from recounting historical irony, sent a very reasonable message to Administrator Frost. He pointed out that the deadline had expired, that the colony should have been evacuated, and that the presence of 47 human vessels did not change the fundamental military mathematics. He had 40 warships. Humanity had 47 civilian vessels with improvised weapons. Professional military force versus amateur confusion. He demanded immediate surrender. Administrator Frost sent back a single-line response, which has since been taught in every human diplomatic academy, as either the worst or best example of crisis communication, depending on who's teaching the course. She said, "We're still filing paperwork. Please hold." General Rathis emitted a frequency that translated as existential bewilderment mixed with grudging respect. And the Imperium accepted this? "Oh no," the human said, and her tone suggested the story was about to achieve velocity. The Imperium commander did what any reasonable military leader would do when faced with bureaucratic absurdity. He opened fire on the defense platforms, intending to demonstrate that paperwork was less important than plasma bombardment. This was tactically sound, strategically justified, and profoundly misunderstood the situation he was actually in. The Paladin's shield shifted again, a movement so slight that only combat veterans would notice. It was the Aegis-born equivalent of nodding in confirmation. He had been there. He knew what came next. The moment the Imperium fired on those platforms, Administrator Frost sent out a second message. Not to the Imperium, but to all 47 civilian vessels now in the system. The message said, "Hostile action confirmed. Please document with extreme prejudice." The human let that statement breathe for a moment, giving the Cygnus Elite time to process the implications of the phrase "document with extreme prejudice" being used in a military context. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a documentation event that involved high-velocity kinetics. The civilian vessels, none of which had military training or coordinated combat doctrine, all responded to the Imperium's aggression by doing what civilian vessels do when threatened. They improvised, panicked, and threw everything they had at the problem while filling out incident reports. The mining ships used their industrial lasers to document the hull integrity of Imperium vessels by removing it. The transport haulers used their cargo manipulation fields to record the structural weaknesses of enemy ships by pulling them apart. And that cruise liner, that beautiful antique museum ship, started firing weapons from 6 different historical periods simultaneously, creating a barrage that the Imperium's tactical systems couldn't classify because half the weapons predated their entire civilization. Commander Rethonus made a sound that his species reserved for moments when reality had exceeded their neurological capacity for processing absurdity. They won through disorganized chaos. They won, the human corrected, because the Imperium was fighting a military engagement while humanity was conducting aggressive documentation. The chain commander kept trying to establish proper battle lines, coordinate targeting, execute standard fleet tactics. Meanwhile, human vessels were doing things like ramming enemy ships while broadcasting legal notifications about property damage, or using mining charges to sample the interior composition of Imperium hulls. The human's expression suggested she found this memory personally delightful rather than professionally appropriate. The engagement lasted 4 hours. The chain Imperium lost 32 of their 40 ships, not because they were outfought, but because they were trying to fight while humanity was doing something that their tactical databases had no reference for. Administrator Frost never ordered a retreat. The civilian vessels never established a command structure. Nobody knew what they were doing, which meant the Imperium had no idea how to counter it. The silence in the Obsidian Spire had achieved a quality that transcended mere absence of sound. It was the silence of individuals who had spent their entire lives perfecting the art of warfare suddenly confronting the possibility that perfection was irrelevant when faced with weaponized incompetence. The walls, constructed from ships that had chosen death over dishonor, seemed to hum with something that might have been confusion, or might have been the architectural equivalent of laughter. Commander Ethonus broke the silence first, his forearms gesturing in a pattern that his species used when their primary language failed to capture the necessary nuance. You are telling us that humanity earned a place among the unbroken, not through tactical brilliance or martial honor, but through institutional failure to process the concept of retreat. Oh, it's so much better than that, the human replied, her enthusiasm suggesting she had been waiting for exactly this question. Because after the battle, after the Imperium's surviving ships limped away and the civilian vessels returned to whatever they had been doing before bureaucracy interrupted them, the galactic community tried to figure out what had actually happened. Military analysts studied the engagement for months. They were looking for the hidden strategy, the clever coordination, the secret human tactical doctrine that had defeated a professional military force. She paused, savoring the moment like someone about to deliver the final line of a very long setup. They found nothing, no strategy, no coordination, no doctrine, just 47 different civilian captains, all responding to the same bureaucratic notification in 47 different ways, unified only by their shared confusion about what they were supposed to be doing, and their collective agreement that the Imperium had been rude about the paperwork. High Executor Phaenon's energy form pulsed in a rhythm that suggested his species' equivalent of a migraine. This cannot be how warfare functions. It's not how warfare functions, the human agreed. It's how humanity functions. We don't retreat when we should, because sometimes we're too busy arguing about proper procedure to notice we're supposed to be running away. Administrator Frost became a minor celebrity for about 6 months, before being quietly reassigned to a position where she couldn't accidentally start any more wars. The civilian captains all filed their incident reports, most of which were longer than the actual battle, and the galactic community added a new tactical classification to their military databases. Human institutional momentum, threat level indeterminate, counters unknown. General Rathus leaned forward, her posture suggesting either aggression or the desperate need to understand something that refused to make sense. And you tell us this story why? To mock our traditions, to suggest that honor and sacrifice are meaningless. The human's expression softened slightly, though her smile retained enough edge to remain concerning. I tell you this story because there's a difference between being unbroken by choice and being unbroken by accident. You, all of you, have earned your place here through conscious decisions to stand when standing meant death. You chose honor over survival. You understood the cost and paid it anyway. That's worthy of respect and commemoration. She gestured around the chamber, encompassing the assembled warriors and the monument they stood within. But humanity, we stumble into being unbroken because someone forgot to file the retreat paperwork, or because our bureaucratic systems decided that property damage requires documentation regardless of ongoing plasma bombardment, or because we were too busy arguing about regulations to notice we were supposed to be fleeing for our lives. We don't retreat not because we're brave, but because we're confused, stubborn, and our institutional systems have their own momentum that sometimes runs perpendicular to common sense. The Paladin finally spoke, his voice resonating with the depth that came from vocal cords designed to be heard over battlefield chaos. I was at Frost Harbor. I had been assigned to protect a chain Imperium diplomatic vessel that was supposed to arrive after the colony's surrender. Instead, I watched civilian ships fight professional warships using tactics that violated every principle of military science I had been taught. I watched humans win, not through superiority, but through sheer refusal to acknowledge they were losing. His shield shifted, rising slightly in what Aegis-born body language recognized as a salute of acknowledgement. I requested reassignment after that engagement. I spent 3 years studying human military history, trying to understand if Frost Harbor was an anomaly or a pattern. What I discovered was terrifying. Humanity has been accidentally unbroken for their entire spacefaring history. They do not choose honor over survival. They simply forget that survival requires retreat, or they get distracted by paperwork, or they decide that running away requires too many forms to fill out. The Paladin's gaze swept across the Cygnus Elite,
his shield now held in a position that the assembled commanders recognized as protective, but not threatening. I chose to offer my protection because humanity represents something more dangerous than any warrior tradition. They represent chaos that occasionally achieves order through sheer statistical probability. You cannot predict them because they cannot predict themselves. You cannot defeat their tactics because they do not have tact. They have institutional momentum and aggressive confusion, and those prove remarkably effective against species who insist on fighting properly. Commander Rithonus felt something that might have been understanding, or might have been the early stages of a nervous break. So the human is here not as a member of the Cygnus Elite, but as a warning. I prefer to think of myself as an educational resource, the human interjected cheerfully. But yes, essentially, you are all unbroken by choice, by honor, by conscious sacrifice. Humanity is unbroken by accident, by bureaucracy, by institutional failure to process the concept of strategic withdrawal. Both results look the same from the outside: refusing to retreat, holding ground against impossible odds, winning battles that should have been lost. But the reasoning behind them is so fundamentally different that it might as well be two different species experiencing the same outcome through completely unrelated processes. She turned to face the commemorative wall, where the names of the legendary Unbroken were inscribed in materials designed to outlast stellar collapse. You should know that humanity is going to keep accidentally achieving unbroken stat, not because we're trying to, but because our species has apparently evolved to turn confusion into a survival trait. We will forget to retreat, or argue about the proper forms for retreating, or decide that retreating requires a committee decision, and the committee is busy, and we will win battles through sheer institutional stubbornness, masquerading as tactical decision-making. The human turned back to the assembled commanders, and her expression carried genuine respect mixed with her ever-present amusement. So here's my joke, the one I came here to tell. What's the difference between the Cygnus Elite and humanity? You never retreat because you're too honorable. We never retreat because we're too confused. But to everyone watching from the outside, we're all the same, unbroken, standing firm, refusing to yield. The galaxy can't tell the difference between your courage and our chaos, which I think is both hilarious and slightly concerning. The Obsidian Spire's lighting stabilized, as if the structure itself had finally processed the implications of what it had just heard. The Cygnus Elite stood in their monument to conscious sacrifice, confronted with the reality that their most sacred military tradition had been accidentally replicated by a species that treated warfare like a particularly aggressive filing system. Malfunction. High Executor Phaenon's energy form flickered in a pattern that might have been amusement, or might have been existential resignation. You have fundamentally disturbed my understanding of military honor. Yeah, we do that, the human agreed. It's kind of our thing. We disturb everyone's understanding of everything, usually without meaning to, and then we apologize but keep doing it anyway because our bureaucratic systems have already classified it as standard procedure. General Rathus made a sound that suggested she had moved past confusion and into something resembling resigned acceptance. I fought human forces during the border disputes. I thought they were employing some form of advanced psychological warfare. You are telling me they were simply disorganized, catastrophically disorganized, the human confirmed. But disorganized with enough firepower and institutional momentum that it stopped mattering. Chaos is a surprisingly effective force multiplier when applied with sufficient volume and bureaucratic backing. Commander Rithonus found himself doing something he had never done in any Cygnus Elite gathering. He laughed. It was a harsh, raspy sound that his species reserved for moments when the universe revealed itself to be fundamentally absurd, but it was laughter nonetheless. Several other commanders joined him, their various species expressing mirth in frequencies that ranged from subsonic to potentially damaging to unshielded electronics. The human smiled, apparently satisfied with the response she had provoked. The paladin's shield lowered slightly, a gesture that the Aegis-born used to indicate that a defensive situation had resolved peacefully. The Cygnus Elite, warriors who had never retreated from anything in their lives, found themselves retreating from the certainty that military honor followed consistent logical principles. As the gathering began to dissolve, commanders approaching the human to ask questions about other instances of accidental human tactical brilliance, Commander Rithonus reflected on the nature of what it meant to be unbroken. Perhaps, he thought, the method mattered less than the result. Or perhaps humanity had discovered something that proper military species had missed, that confusion, stubbornness, and bureaucratic momentum could achieve the same outcomes as honor and sacrifice, just with significantly more paperwork and considerably less dignity. The Obsidian Spire floated in the void, monument to those who chose not to retreat. It would continue floating there, commemorating sacrifice and honoring the unbroken. And it would do so with the uncomfortable knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy, humans were accidentally achieving the same legendary status by forgetting to file their withdrawal forms on time. The human had been telling a joke among the Cygnus Elite, and the punchline was simple: humanity had earned its place among the unbroken, not by choosing honor, but by being too bureaucratically confused to choose anything else. The Paladin held his shield beside her not to protect her from the galaxy, but to protect the galaxy from the chaos she represented. And somehow, against all military logic and tactical doctrine, that was working.